Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, July 26th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The West expects an open-ended conflict in Ukraine. So the U.S. and its allies are worried that Ukraine's stalled counteroffensive means the war between Russian and Ukrainian forces will be an open-ended conflict. And this is according to a report from the Wall Street Journal that was published on Tuesday. The report said the U.S. was hoping that Ukraine would regain some territory, and that would pave the way for a negotiated settlement. Although, I find it hard to believe that the Biden administration is really thinking about diplomacy at all, since it has discouraged negotiations throughout the war. But President Biden did say earlier this month, quote, "My hope is and my expectation is you'll see that Ukraine makes significant progress on their offensive and it generates a negotiated settlement somewhere along the line," end quote. But without any significant Ukrainian gains, the West is preparing to support the proxy war against Russia for years to come. So an unnamed Western diplomat told the Wall Street Journal, quote, "The only real response is an industrial mobilization that will give Ukrainians and the Russians a clear message that the Ukrainians will always have plenty of what they need," end quote. So this diplomat said that the U.S. should, get ready to accept that the war will not end anytime soon. Biden administration officials have repeatedly said that they're willing to arm Ukraine for as long as it takes, but it's unclear if the U.S. and its NATO allies can sustain support for Ukraine, as officials are warning Western military stockpiles are running low. So you notice what that Western diplomat said that they need an industrial mobilization, and that has all sorts of implications if it's something the U.S. would, invoke the Defense Production Act. I think those are ideas that they're talking about right now within NATO is, turning car factories into ammunition factories like they did during World War II. So time is also on Russia's side, as potential political changes in the U.S. could impact the level of support that Ukraine receives. So this report said that a stalemate could bolster the argument of those inside the U.S. who oppose supporting Ukraine in the conflict, although the reality is the opposition to this policy of pouring all these weapons into Ukraine is still relatively small in Congress. That's just the reality, the unfortunate reality. A U.S. official told the Wall Street Journal that it's still too early to assess the Ukrainian counteroffensive since Kiev has not committed all of its combat brigades that were trained by NATO. The official said, quote, "If they commit their reserves and their reserves aren't successful, then we will have to determine the way ahead." The Wall Street Journal also recently reported, as I covered, that Western officials knew Ukrainian forces did not have enough training or equipment to dislodge Russian forces, but they just hoped that the counteroffensive would succeed anyway. So that was the attitude that they have. And, we know the U.S. did not expect Ukraine to regain much territory. So a European official quoted in this new report said that his government does not believe Ukraine can regain all the territory Russia has captured. But the government in Kiev maintains that recapturing all the territory is its goal, including Crimea. And that tells us, as long as the U.S. and NATO are backing this Ukrainian government, this war is just going to keep going. Again, time's on Russia's side. They don't have any motivation now to, make any compromises with this current government in Kiev. So that's just the situation. If this support keeps flowing, this stalemate, this war is just going to continue, and lots of people are going to keep dying. And I know I've been kind of covering a lot of these reports lately, and this is anonymous officials speaking to the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the New York Times. But I think it's important because, what this shows is we're not seeing anything positive about this Ukrainian counteroffensive. It's across the board negative feedback from U.S. and Western officials, speaking to the media, which I think is significant because for so long, while there was always these doubts and, the truth would come through occasionally, the overall narrative is that, Ukraine can regain territory. That's what the Biden administration is still telling people, but the reality seems to be much different. So definitely significant that, none of these Western officials are saying, oh, we think they could regain steam and, push through. That just doesn't seem to be what they're thinking at all. All right, the next one here is some bad news. Victoria Nuland promoted to acting Deputy Secretary of State. So this article is from Responsible Statecraft from Connor Eccles. In a little remarked move, the Biden administration announced Monday that Victoria Nuland will take over as the acting second in command at the State Department. She replaces Wendy Sherman, who plans to retire at the end of this week. I didn't see this reported anywhere else, and they linked to here an announcement from Blinken saying how great Wendy Sherman is. She's the Deputy Secretary of State, and he mentions that Victoria Nuland will be replacing her as the acting Deputy Secretary of State. Nuland's appointment will be a boon for Russia hawks who want to turn up the heat on the Kremlin, but for those who favor a negotiated end to the conflict in Ukraine, a promotion for the notoriously undiplomatic diplomat will be a bitter pill, and I certainly agree with that sentiment. So a few quick reminders about who Nuland is. When she was serving in the Obama administration, she had a now infamous leaked call with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. So this was as the Maidan was going on, the coup in Ukraine, and she was speaking with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and expressed support for putting Arseniy Yatsenyuk into power. And then just later that month, Yatsenyuk was the prime minister of Ukraine in the post-coup government after they threw out Yanukovych. And at one memorable point in the call, Nuland said F the EU in response to Europe's softer stance on the protest. So the controversy surrounding the call and the larger implications of U.S. involvement in the ouster of Yanukovych kicked up tensions with Russia and contributed to Putin's decision to seize Crimea and support an insurgency in eastern Ukraine. And, this all sparked that war in eastern Ukraine, this coup. So her handing out of food to demonstrators on the ground in Kiev, everybody knows about that. Victoria Nuland was walking around handing out cookies to protesters. You just imagine a protest in Canada or something, and there's Russian officials walking around handing out treats. It's just, we can't even wrap our minds around that. So Nuland, along with State Department sanctions czar Daniel Fried, then led the effort to punish Putin through sanctions. And she's known to be, basically the hardest line official on Russia in the Obama administration at the time. Now it's tough to say. I mean, you have Blinken and Sullivan there, very hard line as well. So Nuland's hawkish inclinations continued after she left the Obama administration back in 2020. She penned a foreign affairs essay titled Pinning Down Putin, in which she called for a permanent expansion of NATO bases in the alliance's eastern flank. And she was also opposed to the idea of extending the New START treaty, or a free rollover of the New START, as she called it. And that was the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia that President Biden and President Putin renewed in 2021. So since returning to the State Department under President Biden, she has showed little interest in a dovish turn. In an interview earlier this year, Nuland called Putin a 19th century autocrat and justified Ukrainian attacks in Crimea, which Russia has called the Red Line. She said that the U.S. supports Ukrainian attacks in Crimea. So with U.S.-Russia tensions at their highest point in decades, Russia knows exactly who Nuland is. This is going to be received, very negatively in Moscow. And Connor says that there is some reason for hope because in the statement announcing Sherman's retirement, the Biden administration did not say if she's going to be nominated to formally take over as Deputy Secretary of State. So hopefully she doesn't become second in command at the State Department, but I think there's a good chance, if they're putting her in that position. And I think, her views align very well with President Biden and Blinken and Sullivan, the people running the foreign policy. Her uber hawkishness is not really out of line with what they're doing. And another thing not mentioned in the article is who Victoria Nuland is married to, which is Robert Kagan, who's a very infamous neocon. He co-founded the Project for a New American Century think tank in the 1990s with Bill Kristol, and they're, known as the architects of the Iraq War. I mean, really bad people here, and, she just keeps getting, these nice jobs within U.S. administrations. All right, the next one here, a new $400 million arms package for Ukraine. So the Biden administration announced on Tuesday a new $400 million weapons package for Ukraine that includes ammunition for artillery and air defense systems, anti-tank weapons, and lots of other types of equipment. So the arms are being provided through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the administration to send weapons to Ukraine directly from U.S. military stockpiles. The Pentagon said in a press release that the package is the 43rd drawdown from U.S. stockpiles for Ukraine since August 2021. According to the Pentagon, the arms package includes the following. It's quite a few things here. Additional munitions for Patriot air defense systems and the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems, Stinger anti-aircraft systems, additional ammo for the HIMARS, artillery rounds of all sizes, 32 Stryker armored personnel carriers, so some armored vehicles, tow missiles, Javelin and other anti-tank systems, Hornet unmanned aerial systems, Hydra 70 rockets, tactical air navigation systems, demolition munitions, over 28 million rounds of small arms ammunition and grenades, night vision devices and thermal imagery systems, spare parts, training munitions, and other field equipment. The Pentagon also released a fact sheet that said the administration has pledged more than $43 billion in military equipment for Ukraine since Russia invaded in February 2022. And these funds are still being pulled from the $113 billion that Congress has authorized so far. I'm not sure how much is left. I'm trying to find out. I asked the State Department, and they referenced me to the Pentagon, and I haven't heard back from the Pentagon. So hopefully they'll tell me. But I wouldn't be surprised if soon the White House is going to be asking for more money to spend on this war. All right, the next one here. The German army says that Ukraine is wasting its NATO training. So on Tuesday, the German newspaper Bild reported that the German military is blaming Ukraine's lack of success in its counteroffensive on the tactics of its commanders. According to a leaked German military report, Berlin's armed forces think that Ukraine's commanders and battle-hardened troops are not using their Western training. U.S. officials have made similar complaints in comments to the media, saying that Ukraine is not using combined arms tactics, which integrate armor, infantry, and artillery. The German report said that Ukraine was breaking up its NATO-trained brigades into much smaller units. The report read, quote, "Some of the troop units are divided up in so many small sections that each troop unit does something, but a joint combat leadership is not recognizable," end quote. So while criticizing Ukraine's tactics, again, Western officials have also acknowledged that Ukraine didn't have enough equipment and training in the first place. And Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, has pointed out that NATO, these NATO countries that are criticizing their offensive and saying they're not using their training, would never launch an offensive like this without air superiority, which Ukraine certainly does not have. So after taking heavy losses in the first few weeks of the counteroffensive, Ukrainian leaders have said their forces changed gears and are working to dismantle vast minefields laid by Russia, and that's why they're moving slowly. That's what the Ukrainians are saying. But the U.S. and its allies seem like they just want them to go harder. Who cares how many people die? Let's inflict as much pain as we can on Russia. And if lots of young Ukrainian men die in the process, it doesn't matter. All right, I just want to take this moment to mention our sponsor for today's show, which is the Expat Money Summit. So if you go over to expatmoneysummit.com, you'll see that it is an online event being held from October 2nd to October 6th, and the host is Mikkel Thorup, who runs Expat Money. He's a listener of this show, so he's a supporter of antiwar.com, and his work focuses on helping people that are considering getting citizenship or residence in another country, taking those steps. And he has lots of great resources, to guide you in that direction. And that's what this summit is all about. And the great news is that it's free. So you go to expatmoneysummit.com, you enter your email, and you reserve your free ticket, or you could click on the link in the YouTube description or the podcast show notes. And what this is focusing on, this summit has a lot of great speakers that are very knowledgeable about these topics. But again, it includes helping with residences and citizenships. And this isn't just for people that want to move out of the country. It's also for people that want kind of a backup plan or a plan B if things go down, where you live, in, whether it's in the U.S. or another country, and you want to get out. It's good to have the option. For me, my wife is Australian, so that means my son can get citizenship easily. We would even though Australia might not be the best place to go now, I kind of just like knowing that it's an option for us. It's kind of a comforting thought. And another thing that this summit covers, which I think is really important, is wealth protection and tax planning, how you can pay, as little taxes as possible, which is always good because that means you're not funding, you're less likely to be funding wars, investing in diversification, the expat lifestyle. And again, I think this is a really great resource, especially in this age, as more people are working online like myself, and, you can move around, community and networking, which is always important for people that move out of country, and much more. So go check it out, expatmoneysummit.com. And you'll see some of the speakers: Peter Schiff, Mark Faber, Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Jim Rogers, Marissa Medin, and more. So definitely check that out. Again, Mikhail is great. I did his podcast recently, the Expat Money podcast, so go check that out. We had a good conversation. All right, back to the news here. So the next story at antiwar.com, China hits back at Japan over Taiwan comments. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry on Tuesday hit back at Japan over comments made by a Japanese official about Tokyo potentially assisting Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. So Toshiro Ino, who's Japan's Minister of State for Defense, made the comments in an interview with The Telegraph that was published on Sunday. He said that if countries around the world support Taiwan like the U.S. and its allies are backing Ukraine, then it would be very possible that we will provide some kind of support to Taiwan. He said that he's unsure if it would mean military aid or other types of support. He said, quote, "I am not sure at this juncture whether it is going to be defense equipment support or whether it is going to be logistics support," end quote. So responding to these comments, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning warned Tokyo to stop playing with fire on the issue of Taiwan. She said, quote, "The remarks of the incumbent high-level official of Japan's Defense Department constitute blatant interference in China's internal affairs," end quote. She said that the comments have a damaging effect on the political foundation of China-Japan relations. She reaffirmed China's desire to bring Taiwan under its control, saying the, quote, "complete reunification of the motherland is the common aspiration of all the sons and daughters of the Chinese nation and an unstoppable historical trend," end quote. Japan is currently undergoing a major military buildup to bring its total military spending to over 2% of its GDP over the next 5 years, up from 1% of its GDP. The buildup is being done in the name of countering China, as the government of Prime Minister Fumio Kishida released a national security strategy that called Beijing the biggest strategic challenge, and that is echoing language in U.S. military strategy documents. And of course, the U.S. is encouraging all of this. They're encouraging Japan's military buildup and encouraging Japan to boost military ties with other nations as its efforts to build an alliances in the region. And this policy breaks from Japan's post-World War II constitution that was imposed by the U.S., that says Japan can only have a military for self-defense. Now they're buying, long-range missiles, so this is a big aspect of what is happening over there when it comes to the U.S. building these alliances, building up militarily in the region, as Japan plays a big role in it. All right, the next one here. China replaces its foreign minister, but big political questions linger. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and it's interesting. So Qin Gang, who was the Chinese foreign minister, he was missing for a little while. I believe, nobody saw him publicly since June. And his replacement is Wang Yi, who is currently considered China's top diplomat in a position with the Communist Party. So he's also going to fill the role of foreign minister, which was his previous role. So I'll read from some of this article. China has replaced its foreign minister Qin Gang with his predecessor Wang Yi in an unprecedented move that leaves more questions than answers to one of the most engrossing political dramas in recent years. Citing a decision by the nation's top legislation body, state media said simply on Tuesday that Qin, who disappeared from the public view in June, was removed from his position. The reports did not elaborate or say what will happen to the former senior diplomat or his other responsibilities. Qin, who was promoted by Chinese President Xi Jinping just 7 months ago, is also a state councilor and a member of the ruling Communist Party's Central Committee. So they didn't say anything about removing him from that position. So it's kind of odd. Sorry, let me just click this. All right. So while he is now most likely to lose these positions as well, there was no mention of them in Tuesday's statement, leaving the public guessing as to the cause of this abrupt change. So it's not clear if it's, if he did something to anger Xi or, other party leaders, or if, it's like health problems or something. It's just not clear what's going on. Equally puzzling with his replacement, instead of promoting another candidate, the leadership passed the position to Wang, who was promoted to the powerful Politburo just months ago and was a rank higher than Qin. So that's the situation with China's foreign minister. So we'll see how it plays out. And he was the U.S. ambassador, the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. before being assigned the foreign minister, and he kind of had a quick rise. I'm not too familiar with the inner workings of the Communist Party in China, but I forget. I'm not sure what his position was before being the ambassador in the U.S., but he went, from what I've read just in Chinese media, he went pretty quickly from a lower position to becoming the foreign minister, and now all of a sudden he's replaced. So we'll see what happens with him. All right. Sorry, let me just get situated here. I'm a little messed up. All right, so the next one here. The U.S. claims a Russian jet struck a U.S. drone with a flare. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and it's another encounter between U.S. and Russian aircraft over Syria. Washington says a Russian fighter jet deployed a flare that made contact with an American MQ-9 drone in the skies above Syria over the weekend. The White House and the Kremlin have traded accusations that the other is conducting dangerous operations in Syria during the past several months. So the head of U.S. Air Force's Central said on Tuesday that one of the Russian flares struck the U.S. MQ-9, severely damaging its propeller. And he said, fortunately, the MQ-9 was able to maintain flight and safely recover the aircraft to its home base. So he went on to demand Russian forces de-escalate. He said, quote, "We call upon the Russian forces in Syria to put an immediate end to this reckless, unprovoked, and unprofessional behavior." End quote. However, Moscow maintains that Washington is responsible for the confrontations over Syria. This is just, 2 days after Russia was saying that a Russian fighter jet had an incident with a drone. So I guess this was the same situation. And, they were blaming it on the U.S. side. So this is the quote from the Russian official. He said, quote, "Of special concern is a near mid-air collision of a coalition's MQ-9 unmanned aerial vehicle with Russian warplanes near Al-Bab. Russian pilots once again demonstrated high professionalism and took timely measures to prevent collisions with the coalition's unmanned aerial vehicles," end quote. So both sides are saying the other is to blame, that for this close call, whatever exactly happened. And again, just very concerning, and that is the nature of the U.S. presence in Syria. It's a huge tripwire, very dangerous presence there. All right, the last story here in the news section. The U.S. will not be cutting military aid for Israel, which probably doesn't sound like news. So while the Biden administration has expressed concern about the judicial overhaul being pushed forward by the Israeli government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, it has made clear U.S. military aid to Israel will not be affected. This is State Department Deputy Spokesman Vedant Patel. He said on Tuesday, quote, "There is not going to be any cut or stoppage of military aid, and that is because our commitment to Israel and our commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. Our decades-long partnership with Israel is ironclad, end quote. So the U.S. provides Israel with $3.8 billion in military aid each year. So his comments came a day after Israel's Knesset voted to abolish Israel's reasonableness standard, which eliminates the Supreme Court's ability to block government decisions it deems unreasonable. The law passed amid massive demonstrations against the judicial overhaul and a vote of 64-0, as the opposition did not vote in protest. So Patel said, quote, "It is clear that the legislation has consequences for people's day-to-day lives, and that is why we said that such changes in democracy require a broad consensus," end quote. So last week, President Biden signaled that the judicial overhaul could impact the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel, but after the vote, the administration was quick to assure Israel that it had full military support from the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke with his Israeli counterpart, Yoav Gallant, by phone on Tuesday. The Pentagon said in a readout of the call, quote, "Secretary Austin made clear that U.S. commitment to Israel's security is steadfast and unwavering, and affirmed that the Department of Defense is focused on initiatives that deepen military cooperation," end quote. So concerning the judicial overhaul, the Pentagon said that Austin underscored the United States' belief that broad consensus through political dialogue is crucial in democracy. So that seems to be the talking point from the Biden administration. They're saying broad consensus. You got to make sure more people are on board with this, but it's not really going to impact this special relationship. Austin also urged his Israeli counterpart to address extremist settler violence against Palestinians. But the Netanyahu government's recent bombing campaign in Gaza that happened a few months ago, and all of the uptick in violence in the West Bank, the raids, especially in Jenin. So all this violence together has contributed to the death of more than 200 Palestinians in this year alone, which is much more than last year. But that stuff, the U.S. Biden administration isn't concerned about that. Both times during the bombing campaign in Gaza and during that big raid in Jenin, the Biden administration came out and said that they supported Israel, what they were doing. They said, "We support Israel's right to defend itself," while they're launching those assaults. So no problems there, but this judicial overhaul, they're not too happy about. But again, I don't think it's really going to impact anything. And then if a Republican's elected, they're going to say, do whatever you want. We don't care about the overhaul. They might even, try to make it up to them. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from John Reynolds. Oppenheimer reignites debunked arguments in support of nuking whole cities. One from Rebecca Gordon. The U.S. refuses to play by the world's rules. One from Jordan Prescott over at the American Conservative. Establish a special inspector general for war. One from Jacob Hornberger over at the Future Freedom Foundation. A constantly shifting array of official enemies. And our spotlight is from Daniel L. Davis, Why Ukraine's Counteroffensive is Failing. And that is over at Responsible Statecraft. That is everything for me for today. You could always help us out at antiwar.com/donate. And another big way you could help is by telling people about antiwar.com and this show, spreading the word, sharing it on social media, liking, subscribing, commenting. All that really helps out. But I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.